Hi, it's Jeff from the well again. Today is Palm Sunday. What that means is that as we're headed toward Easter, which is next Sunday, today is the remembrance of the day that Jesus made his triumphal entry into Jerusalem. And the story goes like this. Now, when they drew near to Jerusalem, to Bethphage and Bethany, at the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent two of his disciples and said to them, "Go into the village in front of you, and immediately as you enter it, you will find a colt tied on which no one has ever sat. Untie it and bring it. If anyone says to you, 'Why are you doing this?' say, 'The Lord has need of it, and will send it back here immediately.'" And they went away and found a colt tied at a door outside in the street, and they untied it. And some of those standing there said to them, "What are you doing untying the colt?" And they told them what Jesus had said, and they let them go. And they brought the colt to Jesus and threw their cloaks on it, and he sat on it. And many spread their cloaks on the road, and others spread leafy branches that they had cut from the fields. And those who went before and those who followed were shouting, "Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David. Hosanna in the highest." When you read this, we often talk about how Jesus came in riding on a donkey. And we go to Zechariah 9 and we look at your king comes humble, riding on a colt, the foal of a donkey. And we talk about how humble Jesus was. Or we talk about, when we go to Luke's account of this, how the Pharisees told him, "Tell your disciples to stop making all this noise." And he said, well, if they were quiet, even the rocks would cry out. And so we look at those kind of instances and those kind of thoughts. But one I want to look at today for you to think about is this. What were they shouting? You can read it. It's in Mark chapter 11. You can read it. You should read it. They're shouting, "Hosanna. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David." So there's some nationalistic slogans there, some things that are focused on the Messiah coming. They're expecting that Jesus would be the Messiah. But bookending all of those things here are these words: Hosanna, Hosanna in the highest. Well, what does that mean? Hosanna. That's not a word I use every day. Probably you don't use it every day either. Hosanna. We often read this and we think about it and we think it's some sort of exclamation of praise. But originally the words mean, "Lord help us, Lord save us." And originally it was a prayer for God to work to save them. But over time, it became not just a prayer for God to save them, but praise because of the expectancy that God was going to work to save them. I don't know what your experience of life has been. Mine has been often crying out to God for help in some sort of area. And often as I cry out to God and pray to God and ask for him to be at work, I forget the many times he has already come through and shown himself to be the God of all creation and the God that cares about me and about you. And so I think maybe this is a word that I need to start using more in my everyday life. Hosanna. Lord save us. But not just crying out for help, but also let these words of asking for help also become my praise to God. Because for every time I've ever asked, he's answered. Not always the way I want him to. Let's be honest about that. Not every answer I get from God is exactly the one I want. And sometimes the answers that he gives me are completely different than what I've asked for. And yet his wisdom is greater than mine, and life has shown that his answers have been better for me than my own answers could have been. And so today, on a Palm Sunday, where we are as close to being able to pinpoint the time in the year that Jesus spent his last week on earth before the crucifixion. Let's remember what he did at the cross, but let's remember these words. Hosanna. Hosanna in the highest. And let this become a plea for help, but also a word, a cry, a shout of joy and praise. Because he has been faithful, and he will continue to be. Hosanna. Hosanna in the highest.